Hey YouTube, how's everybody doing today? So in this video tutorial I'm going to discuss the differences between clipping and compression and how you can use them in your production process. So let's get right into it. This video is going to be probably a little bit nerdy. I'm going to talk more than I usually do just because I think once you understand some of the fundamentals behind what's going on with these processes and you can kind of visualize it in your brain, it helps you make better mixing decisions. So anyways, what I've done here is I've loaded in a note on C4 and operator, and it's just playing a sine wave. So we'll listen to that. And what we're going to do is we're going to apply an EQ to the channel. And because this is a sine wave, we notice that there is one fundamental playing. That's at about 518 hertz or so, and there's no frequency content in the upper region here. So a sine wave is just a pitch that oscillates at one tone, consists of a single fundamental, and is completely clean. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to freeze this and flatten it, and then I'm going to open this up and zoom in, and we'll get to see the waveform in the audio editor here. So you can notice that it's been reproduced perfectly, and the top half of this waveform here correlates to your speaker cone basically pushing out, and the bottom half correlates to your speaker cone kind of sucking away. So the relationship between the push and pull here is perfectly in sync. Basically their amplitudes are the same. There's no artifacts along like your downward and upward slopes here, and everything is groovy. So that's why you get basically a completely pure tone when you play a sine wave. Everything's kind of in order. What you're doing when you're clipping a waveform is basically what I'll do is load up a clipper here. You're altering the dynamics of a waveform. Compression and clipping both alter the dynamics of the waveform. So when we clip this, what we're going to basically do is we'll set like a threshold on the clipper or an in and out, and it'll be like, okay, maybe this top portion of the waveform we don't want, and this bottom half of the waveform we're not going to want. So it's like anytime the signal comes in above a certain amplitude or threshold, it's going to just completely flatten it out. So it'll change the sine waveform into something more square-like. So we'll listen to that here. So you can see right here, this is like the amplitude of the signal right now. It's full, right? As we're like, okay, shave off this portion and this portion. So when we do that, what we'll do is I'm going to open or create another audio track and resample quickly. So now we can look at the clipped waveform, and you'll see like the top and bottom of the waveform has been shaved off, right? So there's an abrupt stop from instead of like a smooth transition during that period where the speaker is, transitioning from push to pull kind of, or changing direction. There is a abrupt stop, and what that does is it actually creates kind of like ringing or like a vibration, and this will produce harmonics. So now we don't just have the fundamental anymore. We have a bunch of harmonics sitting on top of it. Now with this type of clipping we're producing, there's even and odd order harmonics, and you can go down the rabbit hole with that, but I'm not going to get into it. We're producing a bunch of different, I think they're odd harmonics within the waveform. So you get brightness basically to your signal. And another thing is the signal's amplitude is smaller because it doesn't reach the top of the waveform anymore. So you've conserved some amplitude and you've created harmonics. So why should we care about this? I'm just going to have some tea because I'm sick. So this is good if we are trying to basically maximize the volume of something and potentially generate a little bit of color while doing it. So sometimes what you can do is if you have like a transient heavy signal, let's see if I can find something here. Let's go and look for a clap. Or something with like a really sharp transient. Okay, I'm lazy, so let's go with this. So let's pretend that this transient is even sharper. I guess what we can do is just look at this. So if we zoom in on this waveform, we can see at the very start here, there's this huge peak, right? And then after that peak occurs, there is a portion that rings out after. So this initial piece here is going to be responsible for like a very quick push-pull relationship of the speaker, and that's going to take up a lot of energy. And if we don't care so much about that initial click, we can cut it off with a clipper. And so this effectively will reduce the dynamic range, because the range between the loudest and softest part of your sound is now reduced, so the dynamic range is reduced. If you don't care about that, if you have a signal that you're not worried about dynamics too much, so maybe just like, say you're producing a techno track or something, and in the background you have a bunch of percussions that are very like clicky kind of, but you don't need them to be because they're supposed to just sit in the background and like they don't really take much attention of the listener, then you can cut those transients off and preserve headroom. And this will help you during the mixing and mastering process, because if you do it properly, you can get more perceived loudness. The downside is that if you do it too much, you can lose the dynamic range within your track, and then everything will start to sound very flat and boring. So take it with a grain of salt. Don't use it on everything. How and when do I know to use this method? That is a question I can't answer. It's all subjective. It's all subjective, and it's all bullshit. So just keep practicing, and you'll eventually figure it out. If your stuff sounds really lifeless and boring, you probably clipped it too much or compressed it too much. So now, enough of my rambling. I'm going to ramble some more in a second, but enough of rambling for now. I'm going to put a compressor on that original signal instead of a clipper. So, sip of tea. I'm coming at you from a separate audio track because my mic kept shitting out on me, so yeah, what's the difference between clipping and compression then? So the answer to that would be that with compression, we have a little bit more control over the way that we are altering the signal's dynamics. And we also, depending on the ratio and the type of compressor and threshold and settings we use, aren't going to be adding as many harmonics as with clipping. So you have your attack here, which tells the compressor how long to take before it turns on. So if you have a very quick attack, then the compression reacts basically instantly within a millisecond here. The release tells it how long before that effect fades out. And then the ratio says like how much of the signal am I going to be reducing by. So a higher ratio, 4:1 ratio, will reduce the dynamic range of whatever your set threshold is by a ratio of about 4:1 dB, I believe. So the more severe you have this ratio set, the more dynamic range you take away. And then the threshold is like, we already kind of discussed that with the clipper. It's basically like, okay, when do I react? So you can see we don't really have much dynamic range here. It's just like a very flat signal, because it's just a sine wave going back and forth at one frequency. But if I pull the threshold down, you can see this little bar comes up here, and it's like, okay, we're reducing the gain of this signal by 24 decibels. And then you have like RMS, which is root mean squared, and that's just like, this is an average, so it takes kind of an average of the signal and it will reduce based off of that average. Peak mode is like detecting the peaks, so the top and bottom, and it'll use those instead of like, you know, somewhere in the middle as an average, which is how our ears kind of operate. Our ears operate more in RMS mode than like in peak mode. We hear averages more so than like the instantaneous 1 millisecond value of something, if that makes any sense. So, and then expand, I'm not going to talk about. The knee is how soft the compression is. So yeah, let's look at it here. This is the best kind of way I can describe it. So you can see when the knee is very, when it's at 0 dB, it's like, all right, right when the signal crosses this threshold, react and flatten it. And then when you move the knee to a larger value, there's a more gradual decrease in the overall attenuation of the signal, so it's more natural sounding. Yeah, so that's that. Do something like this and resample this. So this is the compressed signal here. And we can see the attack and release settings coming into play. So the compressor kicks in really quick because we have an attack set at 1 millisecond. So it's basically instant. And then if you look, you can see the signal gets attenuated, right? But if you look at it, it's still a sine wave. It hasn't been clipped or butchered the same way through clipping. So all it's done is it has brought the volume of that signal down after a specified point. So this is good if you don't want to add a ton of, you know, distortion or harmonics to your signal, if you want to keep things kind of clean. Of course, there are different analog-based compressors that add like some harmonic saturation just based off of like the way that they're modeled and the hardware that they're modeled off of. But this is more of a cleaner way kind of to alter the dynamics of your signal. And with this, you can also choose, like, let's do this again. And what I'll do is I'm going to make the ratio more extreme, and then I'm going to mess with the attack and release settings again. So if we look at this now, because we've told the attack to kind of kick in later, again, the attenuation is much more gradual, right? So its amplitude comes down in volume a lot slower because of that attack that we've set. And I think if we want to look at the actual release as well, what we need to do is we need to put like a halt in the signal so that the compressor can reset. Maybe what I can do, bear with me here, I'm just kind of messing around. Like this. Because we have a long release time, you can see that there's an initial decay. And then again, that release time is still, the compressor's still active here, right? So it's like trying to recover, and it doesn't have enough time to recover. So it continues to dynamically alter the signal. So instead of the peak being present, or the like loudest part of the signal being present the second time that the signal comes in, it's not there because the release is still in play, and so the compressor keeps the signal down. And again, over here you can see it's a little like less accentuated because there's more time, I guess, for that compressor to like come back to life or reset, and there's more of a dynamic here than here. So your attack and release settings are pretty important. You have to make sure that you're setting them properly if you want alter the signal in a certain way. So visually seeing this should give you guys a good idea of what you're doing when you're compressing something, as opposed to clipping it, and what you can do with compression, right? So if you set up your compression correctly, you can, if you have a spiky sound like that clap I showed you before, you can let that initial transient through if that's what you want, and then you can pull the signal down right afterwards. So now it's like the listener's focusing more so on the initial hit rather than the body of the sound. Or if you want to get rid of that click altogether with compression, you can do it. You just set the attack really quickly so the compressor comes in right away. That transient gets pulled down in amplitude, and then the signal is much more flat in its level. You also won't affect the harmonic signature of the sound quite as much with a compressor as opposed to like hard clipping. And of course this varies based off of the settings that you apply and the type of compressor being used. Certain compressors might add some distortion, but yeah, this is the compressed signal, right? So Ableton's compressor doesn't seem to add very much harmonic content to the signal, so it's clean. And yeah, that was a lot of rambling. I hope that it was helpful in some way, shape, or form. If you guys have any questions or comments, let me know, and take it easy.